While any sort of saving for retirement might be beneficial, not all investment vehicles are created equal. According to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, those with workplace pensions will do significantly better in retirement than those who invest only in mutual funds. It found workers may have to work an extra 11 years for mutual funds to match the savings of a workplace pension. Or if they retired at the same age, investors with just mutual funds will have 40% less money. The reason is pretty simple. Management fees on mutual funds eating into profit and returns. On average, fees are about 2% for mutual funds, less than 0.5% for a pension. Not a big difference, perhaps, in a given year for an individual, but compounded over your career, and it can add up. The number of Canadians covered by workplace pensions is also falling. Since 1977, down 43% from 43% of workers to 27% today. And as you can see, even fewer have the gold-plated defined benefit pension. Neil Gross is the Executive Director of the Canadian Foundation for the Advancement of Investor Rights. Great to have you here.
Nice to be here.
This question of fees is one that is really a little bedeviling, because we know that it's true. And in the same way that when we buy a book at the airport, even when the currency's at parity, we see that we are paying more in Canada than they do in the U.S. And Canadians don't seem to rise up and mutiny. Do we just accept high fees when it comes to our investments in a way that is kind of confounding?
Well, it's a little bit Canadian, and it's we are complacent when it comes to that, but also a lot of Canadians are unable to see the fees that they pay, particularly in mutual funds, because they're somewhat hidden. We have a system of paying what are called trailing commissions that come off the top but are paid directly by the mutual fund company to the dealer and the advisor. So the investor never cuts a check. They never really appreciate how much they're paying in fees.
So when we talk about the effect that fees can have, it does add up over time. To me, that should be a fairly simple message that people should just kind of take on board, that fees can eat into, add it to inflation, and you really do start to lose a big chunk of your potential returns. Why is that such a tough sell? Is it because these things feel so complex?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. The average investor doesn't have a high level of financial literacy to begin with. And the concept that these small amounts can add up over time to become very significant is generally beyond a lot of people, unfortunately.
One of the things that's changed in recent years is the advent of a whole variety of low-fee products, index ETFs, that have come into the market. These were once the domain only of high-net-worth individuals. Right. Can anybody buy these now? Is there any barrier to somebody who wants exposure to, say, the Canadian stock market, buying an ETF of the Canadian stock market or an index fund and getting a very, very low fee?
Well, there's no actual barrier, but the effective barrier is that a lot of advisors don't want to recommend them because they don't pay the trailing commission. So they don't steer clients toward them, and if clients don't know to ask for them, it never comes up in the conversation. Plus, some advisors are not licensed to sell them, so investors would have to either find another place to purchase them, or they'd have to do that on their own. And that's a little bit of an impediment.
I know just from talking to friends and family members that people will take the step to invest. They'll shelter their savings in an RSP, and then they won't direct it anywhere because it just feels too complicated. And if you take advice from somebody, and most of us will turn first to whatever bank we deal with, are you almost by definition going to be put into products that favor that individual? In other words, because there are commissions, because they may get sort of incentives to sell their own stuff. Do we need to be really wary about where we take advice?
Yeah, we do. I mean, there are incentives built into the system to push products that may not be in the best interests of the investor, may be much more in the interests of the advisor. And it's one of the reasons why organizations like ours are trying to get a ban on things like trailing commissions that may provide incentives to the advisor that are not aligned with the interests of the investor.
There is a rule change coming, CRM2 is the technical name for it. It will make transparency in the fees that we pay a lot more clear. It'll be more obvious. Why is it so hard to get there? Even now, lobbying has meant that it's been put off for another year, really, until anything happens. Why does the government not say people should see, if they're paying a total of almost 3% every year on their investments, they should see that? Why is this not just easier to fix?
Well, it really should be, but there's been a lot of pushback from the industry and the investment industry. They would prefer not to shine a light on these things, and so they've been very resistant. But fortunately, it seems that this particular initiative will come into effect. We won't see it for another few years. We won't start getting these reports until 2017. But at that point, Investors who are inclined to look closely at these things will have the information they need to assess whether they're getting good value for the money. And they may be able also to start negotiating better deals for themselves.
Comparing, as this study did, the management of a pension fund to the cost of a mutual fund, is that a fair comparison? I mean, pension funds are often in the billions of dollars, and so obviously when you start operating at scale, you can kind of apply economies of scale and your costs come down. Is it an apples to apples comparison?
Not exactly, and you know, however, it's very informative to sort of look at this and ask yourself, why should it be that somebody who just happens to not have a workplace pension, puts in the same amount of money, winds up in such a different situation at the end of 20 years of working or contributing. So we need to address that as a society because it's a very important issue for how a great many Canadians will wind up in retirement. One
of those pensions, of course, that's a quite successful one is the Canada Pension Plan. Would you advocate a system where if individual investors wanted to, they could top up their CPP, in other words, invest alongside the plan in a private account that doesn't have the same kind of safety and security that the CPP does, but that gets invested the same way? Yeah, the ability to buy more CPP units might be a very good idea worth looking at. All right, we're going to leave it there. Thanks for being here, Neil. Thank you. Neil Gross, Executive Director of FAIR Canada.